The cold was a constant companion. It seeped through the worn leather of her boots and clung to the threadbare wool of her dress. It lived in her bones, a deep and abiding chill that no fire could ever truly touch. Alara knelt on the flagstones of the great hall, her hands raw and red from the lye soap and icy water. The scent of pine from the Yule decorations did little to mask the acrid smell of the cleaning solution. She was invisible, a ghost haunting the edges of pack life, her presence a stain they were forced to endure. They called her Death Hand. The midwife who had lost the Luna and her pup. The memory was a fresh wound, a year old but still bleeding. The panic in Luna Anya's eyes, the weakness of her cries, the terrible, final stillness. It played in Alara's mind on a ceaseless loop. Her fault. That's what they all whispered. That's what she believed. She had been the most promising young midwife, her hands supposedly blessed, but on the most important night of her life, those hands had failed. They had delivered only silence and death, and in doing so, had broken their Alpha King. A shadow fell over her. Alara didn't need to look up to know who it was. The scent of expensive winter rose perfume preceded her. "Still scrubbing, Death Hand?" Lyra's voice was sharp and cruel, like ice cracking underfoot. She was Luna Anya's sister. Her grief curdled into a venom she aimed only at Alara. "You can scrub for 1,000 years. You'll never wash my sister's blood from the floor of this pack house, or from your hands." Alara flinched, keeping her eyes down. "My lady," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Look at me when I speak to you," Lyra commanded. Slowly, reluctantly, Alara lifted her head. Lyra was beautiful, with the same silver blonde hair as her sister, but her eyes were hard, chips of frozen stone. She held a silver goblet, her knuckles white around the stem. "They say the Alpha King returns tonight," Lyra said, a sneer twisting her lips. "A year he has mourned in the wildlands. I wonder what he'll do when he sees the wretch who murdered his wife and child is still breathing our air." Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the dull ache of Alara's existence. Kaelin, the Alpha King. He had left the day after the funeral, his face a mask of such profound agony that it had been burned into her memory. She had not seen him since. The thought of facing him was paralyzing. Alara started, but no words came. What could she say? "I'm sorry?" The words were ash in her mouth. Lyra's smile was a predator's. She tipped the goblet, and a cascade of iced wine splashed across Alara's head and shoulders. The shock of the cold was so intense it stole her breath. It dripped down her face like frozen tears. A few nearby pack members snickered. No one moved to help. "A chill for the woman with the coldest hands in the kingdom," Lyra said, her voice loud enough for all to hear. She dropped the goblet, letting it clatter on the stones near Alara's head. "Clean that up, too." Lyra swept away, leaving Alara shivering, drenched, and utterly humiliated. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her forehead to the damp, frigid floor. The cold was a punishment. It was a penance. She deserved it. She deserved all of it. She just had to endure. That was all that was left for her. Endurance. The wind began to howl not long after. It was a mournful sound at first, a whisper of winter's discontent. But within the hour, it became a raging beast, throwing itself against the thick stone walls of the pack house. Snow came with it, not in gentle flakes, but in a blinding horizontal sheet. The elders, their faces grim, called it a ghost fang blizzard, the kind that came only once a century to claim the unwary. The great hall doors burst open, slammed back against the stone by a gust of wind that extinguished half the torches and sent a vortex of snow swirling into the room. A figure stumbled in, collapsing to the floor. He was caked in ice, his face blue with cold. Warriors rushed to him, pulling him toward the central fire. It was one of the Border Patrol scouts. His words came in ragged, desperate gasps. The pass, Ghostwood Pass, collapsed. A hush fell over the hall. Ghostwood Pass was the only route back from the northern wildlands. The Alpha King's escort, the scout choked out, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. Trapped, ambushed by shadows. Then the avalanche. He coughed, a racking sound. The king, he was wounded. Panic erupted. The Alpha King, wounded and trapped in a ghost fang blizzard. It was a death sentence. The pack's chief healer, an ancient wolf named Marius, pushed through the crowd. He looked at the scout, then toward the raging storm outside. I cannot go, he said, his voice heavy with regret. My old bones would freeze before I made it a mile. We need someone younger, someone who knows the mountain paths and the frost herbs. All eyes turned, a slow, collective movement, to land on Lyra. Her father was the Alpha's regent in his absence. Lyra's gaze, however, slid across the room, a malicious gleam entering her eyes. She found Alara, who was trying to press herself into the shadows, wishing the stone would swallow her whole. Send her, Lyra said, her voice ringing with false sincerity. Send the midwife. She knows herbs better than anyone, and she is resilient to the cold. The insult hung in the air. Perhaps she can finally do some good. Let Death Hand go to the dying. A murmur went through the crowd. It was cruel. It was a suicide mission. But no one else volunteered, and it was a command cloaked as a suggestion. Alara was being sent to her death, and she knew it. But a small, stubborn part of her, the part that had helped her survive this past year, straightened her spine. The king was hurt. Her king. Her guilt was a mountain, but her duty, buried deep beneath it, was a bedrock. She met Lyra's triumphant gaze and gave a single, sharp nod. I will go. The journey was a descent into a frozen hell. The wind sliced like claws, and the snow was so thick she couldn't see her own feet. She was wrapped in the thickest furs they could spare, a pack of herbs and poultices strapped to her back, but the cold was relentless. It was a physical entity, a predator hunting her. She followed the memory of the path, her feet moving on instinct. The mountain groaned around her, the storm a symphony of violence. More than once she stumbled, the snow sucking at her legs, trying to pull her down and bury her in a white grave. But the image of the king, wounded, pushed her forward, the man who had every right to hate her. She owed him this. She owed him her life if it meant he might keep his. After what felt like an eternity, she smelled it. Faint, but unmistakable on the wind. Blood and wood smoke. She crested a ridge and saw them. A small makeshift camp huddled in the lee of a massive rock fall. A pathetic fire sputtered against the wind. Figures were slumped in the snow, some moving, some terrifyingly still. The survivors of the escort. She half ran, half slid down the incline, her legs screaming in protest. A warrior with a face grim as granite looked up, his eyes widening in disbelief. A healer? Where is he? Alara asked, her voice tight, her breath pluming in the frigid air. The warrior just pointed with a gauntleted hand, and then she saw him. He was propped against the largest boulder, a great dark cloak dusted with snow. He was massive, larger than any man she had ever seen, his shoulders broad enough to block out the storm, but he was slumped, his head bowed, his breathing shallow and ragged. A dark, ugly stain spread across his side, melting the snow around it crimson. The Alpha King, Kaelin. For a moment she froze. This was the grieving husband, the bereaved father, the man whose world she had shattered. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach, colder than the blizzard. He would kill her. Or worse, he would look at her with that same broken agony, and it would finally destroy what little was left of her. But then he groaned, a low sound of pure pain, and the midwife in her took over. Guilt and fear were luxuries she couldn't afford. He was her alpha. He was dying. She pushed through the snow, dropping to her knees beside him. His skin was pale, tinged with blue. Ice crystals clung to his dark hair and beard. "My king," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't respond. She had to check his pulse. She had to know how close he was. Steeling herself, she reached out a trembling hand, her fingers clumsy in their thick gloves. She pulled one off with her teeth, baring her skin to the biting air. The cold was a shock, but she ignored it. She reached for his neck, for the artery beneath the line of his strong jaw. Her fingertips, numb and icy, made contact with his skin. The world exploded. It was not a sound, but a feeling. A cataclysmic jolt shot up her arm, a force of pure energy that was both lightning and sunrise, ice and fire. It slammed into her chest, knocking the air from her lungs. A silent scream ripped through her mind. The world went white, then gold, then blinding silver. An agonizing, searing heat erupted on her wrist. It felt as if a blacksmith's brand was being pressed into her flesh. She cried out, a real sound this time, and snatched her hand back as if burned. She stared at her wrist, cradling it to her chest. There, on her pale skin, a mark was forming. It bloomed like a flower of fire, intricate lines of glowing silver weaving themselves into a pattern. It was a wolf, its head thrown back in a howl, framed by the radiant corona of a golden sun. The queen's mark. The symbol of a fated mate, a soul bond made manifest. It was a legend, a fairy tale whispered by old women. It was impossible. A deep groan pulled her from her shock. She looked up. The Alpha King's head was no longer bowed. It was raised, and his eyes were open. And they were not the warm brown she remembered from ceremonies and festivals. They were molten gold. They blazed in the dim light of the storm, twin stars of impossible heat and power, and they were fixed on her. He looked past her fear, past her ragged clothes, and saw something deep inside her, something she didn't even know was there. His lips, chapped and blue, parted. A single word escaped on a plume of white breath, a sound that was less a word and more a rumble of ancient thunder, a declaration of cosmic certainty. You. He stared at her, and the golden fire in his eyes intensified. He pushed himself up straighter, the movement costing him, but his gaze never left her. The world seemed to narrow to the space between them, the raging blizzard fading to a distant hum. The pain in her wrist pulsed in time with the frantic beating of her heart. What was happening? This was Kaelin, the broken alpha. But the man looking at her now was not broken. He was something else entirely, something ancient and powerful and terrifying. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to flee into the storm and let it take her. but her body refused. A strange warmth was spreading from the glowing mark on her wrist, a fragile countercurrent against the soul-deep cold she had lived with for so long. It was a warmth that called to something in him, a thread of light connecting her to the golden fire in his eyes. He took a ragged breath, and another word followed the first. It was softer, a possessive growl that vibrated in the very air around them, settling deep in her bones. Mine. Confusion warred with terror in her heart. Mine? Her? The worthless one? The death hand? It made no sense. This man should despise her. He should cast her out, not claim her with a voice that promised both sanctuary and annihilation. Her mind was a maelstrom of denial and disbelief. But the bond, new and shockingly real, sang a different song. It was a song of recognition, of coming home to a place she had never known existed. Her soul, battered and bruised as it was, seemed to reach for him, drawn to his strength like a winter-starved plant to the sun. Powered by a strength that should have been impossible in his wounded state, Kalen began to move. He gripped the edge of the boulder, his knuckles white, and with a guttural roar that was more beast than man, he pushed himself to his feet. The other warriors stared, their expressions a mixture of awe and fear. A moment ago, their alpha had been dying. Now he stood tall, a towering figure against the raging snow, his golden eyes still locked on the kneeling midwife. He took a step toward her, then another. He was unsteady, his side still bleeding sluggishly, but he moved with an unshakable purpose. Alara remained frozen on the ground, unable to move, unable to breathe. He was a mountain walking toward her, a storm given human form. He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she had to crane her neck back to see his face. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable, a harsh landscape of pain, power, and something else. Something that looked terrifyingly like reverence. Without a word, he shrugged off his massive, snow-crusted cloak and draped it over her small shoulders. It was immensely heavy and smelled of pine, winter storms, and him. The warmth of his body still clung to the fur, and it enveloped her, a shocking, intimate comfort that was more overwhelming than the cold had ever been. "Get up," he commanded. His voice was not unkind, but it held an absolute authority that brooked no argument. Her limbs, clumsy and trembling, obeyed. She staggered to her feet, the heavy cloak threatening to pull her back down. He reached out a hand, not to steady her, but to gently cup the side of her face. His palm was huge, calloused, but his touch was surprisingly soft. A jolt, a gentler echo of the first cataclysmic connection, sparked between them. His thumb brushed over her cheekbone. "I have you," he murmured, more to himself than to her. With his gaze still on her, he turned his head slightly. "Corbin!" he bellowed, and the warrior who had first greeted Alara snapped to attention. "We are leaving! Now!" The journey back was a blur. The bond, this terrifying, wondrous thing, seemed to pour strength from him into her, and from her back to him. He moved like a man possessed, organizing the survivors, carving a path through the blizzard with sheer force of will. He kept her tucked close to his side, one arm a constant, solid presence around her shoulders, shielding her from the worst of the wind. She was a whirlwind of sensation. The agonizing pulse of the mark on her wrist, the shocking warmth of his body next to hers, the scent of his skin, the terrifying, possessive fire in his eyes every time he looked at her, and beneath it all, the deep, thrumming hum of the bond, a new and permanent part of her soul. They arrived at the pack house not as a defeated, freezing remnant, but as a procession, led by a king who had returned from the dead. The doors were thrown open, and the warmth and light of the great hall spilled out. The pack stared in stunned silence. They saw their alpha, wounded but standing tall, his eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. And they saw the Omega Midwife, the pariah, wrapped in his personal cloak, held securely at his side. Kaelin ignored them all. He strode directly to the central fire, pulling Alara with him. "Sit," he ordered, pointing to the hearth seat, the one usually reserved for the Alpha's most honored guest. She obeyed without thinking, her mind still reeling. He began barking orders, for Marius the healer to tend to his men, for hot food and wine, for blankets. The hall erupted into frantic activity, but Alara saw none of it. She could only stare at the glowing mark on her wrist, then at the impossible man who had put it there. A sharp gasp cut through the noise. Alara looked up to see Lyra standing a few feet away, her face a mask of horrified disbelief. Her gaze was fixed not on the king, but on Alara's wrist, where the sleeve of her tunic had fallen back, revealing the still faintly glowing mark of the howling wolf and the sun. "No," Lyra whispered, the word brittle with shock. "It cannot be." Her eyes darted from the mark to Kaelin, who was now turning back toward Alara, his expression softening as he looked at her. Lyra's face, in that instant, contorted. The shock curdled into a venomous, unholy rage. She saw it. She understood. The worthless, invisible death hand was somehow the Alpha King's fated mate. His queen. To Lyra, it was the ultimate desecration of her sister's memory, an insult so profound it was an act of war. Alara saw the decision harden in Lyra's eyes. This would not stand. She would not allow it. Lyra's gaze flickered toward a shadowy alcove near the hall's entrance, where one of her family's personal guards stood. She gave a nearly imperceptible nod. The threat had been identified. The first move was about to be made. In the hours that followed, the pack house was a hive of controlled chaos. Kaelin was a whirlwind of motion, seeing to his wounded warriors, debriefing his father-in-law, the regent, on the nature of the ambush. The shadows the scout had mentioned were not mere bandits, but something far more organized and sinister. Yet through it all, his attention remained tethered to Alara. He had Marius tend to his wound, a deep gash from a serrated dark iron blade, but refused the milk of the poppy for the pain. "I will not have my senses dulled," he'd growled, his golden eyes flicking to where Alara sat, still wrapped in his cloak by the fire. He needed to be aware. He needed to protect her. He had her brought to his own chambers, a vast, Spartan room dominated by a huge stone hearth and a bed that looked large enough for 3 men. The air smelled of old leather, wood smoke, and his own distinct, wild scent. It was overwhelming. "You will stay here," he told her, his voice leaving no room for argument. He placed a tray of food, roast meat, fresh bread, cheese, on a table beside her. It was more than she'd eaten in a week. "Eat, rest. No one will bother you." She was his prisoner as much as his guest. A precious, confusing treasure he was hiding from the world until he could make sense of it. Her fear was a constant, cold companion, but it was now laced with a bewildering thread of hope. The way he looked at her, no one had ever looked at her like that. As if she were precious, as if she mattered. Could this be real? Could she, Alara, the failure, the outcast, truly be fated to this magnificent, terrifying man? The glowing mark on her wrist was an undeniable truth. But her mind, conditioned by a year of shame and abuse, refused to accept it. It felt like a dream from which she would have a brutal awakening. The awakening came sooner than she expected. She was picking at the bread, her stomach too twisted in knots to eat, when a soft knock came at the door. It wasn't Kalen. His presence was a force of nature. She would have felt him coming. A young servant girl peeked in, her eyes wide and nervous. "My lady?" she whispered, the title so foreign that Alara almost didn't respond. "Forgive me, but Lady Lyra sent me? It's old Maeve. Her heart is fluttering again, and she's calling for you. She says only you know the right blend of motherwort to calm it." Alara's heart clenched. Old Maeve had been kind to her, one of the few who still offered a gentle smile. And her heart was weak. The midwife's instincts, honed over years of service, rose up, powerful and immediate. A person was in need. "The Alpha King said I was to stay here," Alara said, her voice hesitant. "I know, my lady," the girl said, wringing her hands. "But Lady Lyra said the king is in a war council and cannot be disturbed. She said it would be quicker if you just came. Maeve's cottage is just behind the kitchens. It will only take a moment." It was a lie, a carefully constructed trap, baited with her own compassion. But Alara, whose entire identity was built on helping others, couldn't see it. The thought of Maeve's suffering, calling for her, was a pull she couldn't resist. It was a chance to be useful again, to be a midwife, not a pariah. "All right," she said, rising to her feet. "Just for a moment." She left Kalen's heavy cloak on the chair, feeling strangely exposed without its weight. She followed the servant girl through the winding, less-traveled corridors of the pack house. They bypassed the bustling kitchens and exited through a small, icy side door. The air was frigid. The blizzard had lessened, but the wind still bit at her skin. Maeve's cottage was supposed to be visible from here, its warm light a welcoming beacon, but the path was dark. "This way," the girl urged, pointing toward a narrow alley between the smokehouse and the armory wall. A prickle of unease went down Alara's spine. This was wrong. "Wait," she said, stopping. But it was too late. Figures melted out of the deep shadows of the alley. They were large men, cloaked in black, their faces hidden. They moved with a silent, predatory grace. The servant girl gave a small squeak and scurried away, vanishing into the darkness. Alara turned to run, a scream catching in her throat, but a heavy hand clamped over her mouth. A powerful arm wrapped around her waist, lifting her off her feet. She struggled, kicking and thrashing, but it was like fighting against a stone wall. Then she felt a cold, slick pressure against her wrists. A manacle of polished silver snapped shut around the wrist bearing the Queen's mark. Pain, white-hot and absolute, exploded from the point of contact. It was a profane, scorching agony that didn't just burn her skin, but seemed to sear her very soul. The silver was anathema to the bond, a poison to its magic. The beautiful, thrumming connection to Kalen twisted into a shriek of torment. Through the agony, she felt a distant, psychic roar of pure fury and panic. Kalen. He knew. He felt the violation, the silver's poison. But he was too far away. Another silver manacle was snapped onto her other wrist. A thick, dark hood was thrown over her head, plunging her into a world of suffocating blackness and pain. She was thrown over a shoulder like a sack of grain, and the world began to move. The pain was a living thing. The bond, which had been a source of warmth and strength, was now a conduit for excruciating torture. It felt like a vital part of her was being ripped away, shredded by the corrosive touch of the silver. His distant panic and rage echoed in her mind, amplifying her own terror. She didn't know how long they traveled. The jolting motion of a horse, the biting cold, the unending agony from her wrists. It all blurred into a nightmare. By the time they stopped, she was barely conscious, a whimpering, broken thing. She was dragged from the horse and down what felt like cold stone steps. The air grew damp and smelled of mold and decay. She was thrown onto a hard, cold floor. The hood was ripped from her head. She was in a dungeon cell. The only light came from a single torch flickering outside iron bars. Her captors were gone, but she was not alone. A figure stood in the center of the cell, cloaked in shadows that seemed to cling to him, to be a part of him. He was tall and lean, with an air of cold, aristocratic pride. "So," the man said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone that did nothing to hide the chilling lack of emotion beneath it. "This is the creature that has the great Alpha King tied in knots." He stepped forward, and the torchlight caught his features. He was handsome in a severe, sharp-edged way, with pale skin and hair so black it seemed to absorb the light. His eyes were the color of smoke. "Who are you?" Alara whispered, her voice raw. The silver cuffs on her wrists pulsed with a sickening cold fire. "I am Lord Morven," he said, as if that should explain everything. "And you, little midwife, are the key to my ascension." He paced before her, his movements like those of a patient wolf circling its prey. "For centuries, the line of the Supreme Alpha has drawn power from the heart of the mountain, a formidable but static source. But the legends, the ones Kalen's ancestors tried to erase, spoke of a true catalyst, an exponential amplifier." He stopped and looked down at her, a faint, cruel smile on his lips. "A true soul bond, a queen. With you, Kalen's power would become absolute, unchallengeable, a god walking among wolves." He knelt, his smoky eyes boring into hers. "A reality I simply cannot permit." Morven gestured to the silver chains that bound her wrists to the wall. "This silver, mined from a place of great sorrow, does more than burn. It corrodes the bond. It frays the connection. Soon, during the coming alignment of the twin moons, I will perform a ritual. I will not just sever your bond. I will hijack it. I will pull the power that should be his, amplified by your soul's potential, and take it for myself. You will be the vessel for my coronation as the true Alpha, the Shadow King." Despair, absolute and soul-crushing, washed over her. She was a tool, a pawn, a vessel to be filled and then discarded. The faint warmth she had felt, the whisper of hope, was extinguished, leaving only the gnawing cold and the searing pain. The bond was a thin, fraying thread of agony. She could feel Kalen, a distant storm of impotent fury, searching, raging, but blocked by the malevolent power of this place. She was alone. She was going to die here, and her death would be the weapon that destroyed the man who had looked at her as if she were the sunrise. The last of her strength gave out. She slumped against the cold stone, tears of pain and hopelessness tracing paths through the grime on her cheeks. This was her fate, to bring death and ruin to an Alpha King. Lyra had been right all along. She was Death Hand. The hours crawled by, each one a new eternity of suffering. The silver cuffs were a constant source of torment, a cold fire that ate at her skin and her spirit. The bond to Kalen had dwindled to a razor-thin wire of shared agony. She could feel his frantic, desperate search as a faint, painful throbbing in the back of her mind, a constant echo of his rage and fear. It was a torment all its own, knowing how much her capture was hurting him. Morven had left her to rot in the darkness. the single torch outside her cell her only companion. Its flickering light cast long, dancing shadows that looked like grasping claws. Her hope, which had so briefly and foolishly bloomed, was gone. All that remained was the hollow ache of despair. She had been found only to be lost more completely than ever before. She had been given a glimpse of a home, only to be dragged into a deeper hell. She was nothing. A key. A vessel. A conduit for power she didn't understand. Her entire life had been defined by failure, and now her death would be her greatest failure of all. She would be the instrument of Kaylin's destruction. The thought was more painful than the silver. She closed her eyes, trying to retreat into the darkness of her own mind. She thought of his face, the way his eyes, blazing with gold, had looked at her in the snow, the impossible softness of his touch against her cheek, the weight of his cloak around her shoulders. Mine. The word echoed in her memory, a promise of a life she would now never have. A sob caught in her throat. No, she couldn't just give up. She couldn't let Morven win. She had to fight. But how? She was chained, weak, her own nascent power smothered by the silver. Focusing past the searing pain in her wrists, she reached out with her mind. Not with any power she knew she possessed, but with the raw, desperate core of her being. She reached along the agonizing thread of the bond, calling his name in the silent space of her soul. Kaylin. It was a whisper of thought, a flicker of intent in a vast ocean of pain. She expected nothing, but then something answered. It was not a voice, but a feeling, a surge of warmth, of raw, untamed power pushing back against the cold. It was his essence, his indomitable will, forcing its way through the corrosion and the distance. Alara. His name for her. Not Midwife, not you. Her name. It resonated through the bond, a lifeline in the crushing darkness. Kaylin, I'm sorry, she thought, the shame and guilt overwhelming her. I left. I was so stupid. He's going to use me against you. Not your fault. The response was immediate, fierce, a psychic roar that momentarily silenced the pain. Mine, to protect. I failed. Hold on. Tears streamed down her face, hot against her cold skin. He didn't blame her. Even now, he was trying to comfort her. He's going to sever the bond, she sent, her thought laced with terror. A wave of pure, predatory fury slammed through the connection, so potent it made her gasp. Let him try. He cannot break what is eternal. I am coming. The certainty in that thought was an anchor. It was not a hope. It was a promise, a vow written in soul fire. Hold on, my heart. I am coming. The connection faded, the effort too great to sustain. The cold and the pain rushed back in. But something had changed. The despair was no longer absolute. A tiny, defiant ember of hope had been rekindled in the deepest part of her. He was coming. Her king, her mate, was coming for her. She didn't know how much time passed. An hour? A day? Time had no meaning in the dungeon. But eventually, the heavy bar on her cell door was lifted. Lord Morven stood there, flanked by two of his hulking guards. The moons are in alignment, he said, his voice smooth and cold. It is time. They unchained her from the wall, only to replace the chains with shorter ones, binding her hands in front of her. The silver still burned, but the hope Kaylin had given her was a shield for her spirit. She met Morven's gaze, her own eyes clear and steady. The fear was still there, a frantic bird beating its wings in her chest, but it no longer controlled her. He noticed the change. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. Your defiance is amusing and utterly pointless. They led her from the dungeon, up winding stone staircases. The air grew colder, and she could hear the howl of the wind. They emerged onto the flat, windswept roof of a tower. The sky above was a canvas of deep indigo, dominated by 2 full moons, one silver, one pale blue, hanging so close they almost seemed to touch. Their combined light cast an eerie, ethereal glow over everything. In the center of the rooftop was a large, circular altar carved from black obsidian, etched with glowing red runes. The air crackled with raw, unstable power. Morven's Ember Covenant. A dozen figures in dark red robes stood in a circle around it, their faces hidden by deep hoods. "Chain her to the altar," Morven commanded. The guards forced her onto the freezing obsidian, chaining her silver-bound wrists to iron rings embedded in the stone. She lay on her back, exposed to the elements and the hungry magic of the ritual. The cold of the stone seeped into her back, while the silver fire ate at her wrists. Morven stood over her, a ceremonial dagger with a jagged obsidian blade in his hand. "You will feel a discomfort," he said conversationally. "The severing of a soul is not a gentle process. But do not worry. Your part in this will be over soon." He began to chant in a harsh, guttural language. The red runes on the altar flared, their light pulsing in time with his words. The robed figures took up the chant, their voices a low, droning hum that vibrated in Alara's bones. Pain unlike anything she had ever known erupted from the bond. It felt like a physical hook had been sunk into her soul and was now being brutally twisted. She screamed, a raw, agonized sound that was snatched away by the wind. The thread connecting her to Kaelin was stretched taut, fraying, threatening to snap. She felt his distant, frantic agony as a mirror of her own. The sky seemed to darken. The power in the air grew thick, suffocating. Morven raised the obsidian dagger, its tip glowing with malevolent red energy. "Now!" he roared. "The nexus is open! The power is mine!" He plunged the dagger down, not toward her flesh, but toward the space just above her heart, where the nexus of the soul bond resided. And at that exact moment, the tower wall exploded. Stone and mortar blew inward in a deafening detonation of force. A massive shape, a whirlwind of black fur and incandescent rage, hurtled through the newly made opening. It was Kaelin. Not in his man form, but in his great wolf form. A beast the size of a pony, with fur as dark as a starless night and eyes that burned with pure golden fire. He landed on the rooftop, a low, rumbling growl tearing from his chest, a sound that promised death. Behind him, his elite warriors, the Stirk Wolves, poured through the breach, their own transformations beginning as they charged. The Ember Covenant broke their chant, turning in shock and terror. Kaelin was on them in a heartbeat. He was not a king or a man. He was a force of nature, an avalanche of claws and teeth. He tore through the robed figures, his movements a blur of lethal precision. Morven spun around, his face a mask of fury. "Impossible! How did you find this place?" Kaelin's form shifted, bones cracking and reforming with sickening speed. He rose up as a man, naked to the waist, his skin still bearing the ghost of his wolf form's power. His eyes were no longer gold. They were blazing, solid silver, the color of his pure, untempered wrath. You took what is mine, Kaelin snarled, his voice a low thunderclap. There is no fortress, no shadow that could hide you from me. The two alphas, the King of the Mountain and the would-be Shadow King, collided. The impact sent a shockwave of power across the rooftop that cracked the very stones. They were a blur of motion, trading blows that would kill a lesser wolf 100 times over. Alara could only watch, chained and helpless, her body racked with the aftershocks of the interrupted ritual. The bond, no longer being actively torn, was a raw, open wound. She saw Morven, using his shadow magic, land a vicious blow. A blade of solidified darkness raked across Kaelin's chest. Kaelin roared in pain and stumbled back, clutching a deep, bleeding wound. He faltered, his silver eyes flickering for a moment. Seeing him hurt, seeing him in danger because of her, something inside Alara broke. It was not a gentle crack, but a shattering. The dam of a lifetime of guilt, of fear, of self-loathing, of worthlessness. It all broke apart at once. And what poured out was not despair. It was rage. A pure, triumphant, protective rage. He is mine. The thought was not a whisper. It was a declaration of war. You will not touch him. A power she never knew she possessed, a dormant sun inside her soul, ignited. It was not the dark parasitic magic of Morven, or even the wild primal strength of Kaelin. It was something else. It was the power of life itself, the power of creation, the Aethel. A wave of brilliant golden light erupted from her body. It was not hot like fire, but it was more intense than the sun. The light vaporized the silver cuffs on her wrists, turning them to harmless steam. It shattered the iron rings holding her to the altar. The obsidian stone cracked and split beneath the sheer force of it. The wave of light washed over Kaelin. His wound, the deep, dark gash from Morven's blade, sizzled and closed, leaving unmarked skin behind. He straightened up, his eyes widening in awe as he looked at her. The light then crashed into Morven's shadow-wielding warriors. They screamed, not in pain, but in dissolution. The life force was anathema to their dark magic. They dissolved like smoke in a hurricane, their robes falling empty to the ground. The rooftop fell silent, save for the whistling wind. Alara stood in the center of the shattered altar, her slight frame radiating a power so immense it bent the air around her. Her hair floated as if underwater, and her eyes, once the color of a timid forest floor, now glowed with the same pure golden light that poured from her. Morven, staggering back, stared at her, his composure finally broken, his face a mask of pure terror. What are you?" he stammered. Alara took a step forward, the broken stones of the altar crunching under her bare feet. She felt Kaelin's presence behind her, a solid wall of protective strength, but her focus was entirely on the man who had tormented her, who had tried to use her, who had dared to harm her mate. She raised her head, her voice ringing out with a power she had never known, clear and absolute. "They called me Death Hand," she said, the words a dismissal of her past. "You called me a vessel." She took another step, the golden light around her intensifying. "You were both wrong." She raised a hand, her slender fingers crackling with life energy. "I am his queen." A beam of pure, concentrated golden light, the very essence of life and creation, shot from her palm. It struck Morven square in the chest. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The light enveloped him, and for a moment he was a silhouette against an artificial sun. Then he simply ceased to be. He dissolved into nothingness, leaving not even a shadow behind. The silence that followed was absolute. The battle was over. The golden light radiating from Alara softened, receding back into her until it was just a faint, warm glow under her skin. The power was still there, a deep, calm ocean where before there had been only a desert, but it was quiet now, waiting. She swayed, the adrenaline and the sudden expenditure of immense power leaving her dizzy and weak. Strong arms caught her before she could fall. Kaelin. He pulled her back against his chest, his arms wrapping around her as if he never meant to let go. He buried his face in her hair, and she felt the shudder that ran through his entire body. Alara, he breathed, his voice thick with awe, relief, and a love so profound it stole her breath. He turned her in his arms to face him. His eyes, now back to their molten gold, searched her face. He raised a hand, his touch infinitely gentle, and brushed a stray lock of hair from her cheek. You saved me. You saved us all. She looked up at him, at this magnificent, powerful king who was hers. All the fear, all the confusion had been burned away in the fire of her unleashed power. All that was left was a certainty that mirrored his own. The bond between them was no longer a painful thread, but a deep, resonant chord of perfect harmony. You are mine, she said, her voice soft but firm, echoing the first words he had ever spoken to her in the snow. It was not a question, but a statement of fact, a claiming. A slow, breathtaking smile spread across his face. It was like watching the sunrise after a long, dark night. I have always been yours, he said. From the moment my soul was forged, I was just waiting for you to find me. She reached up, her hand no longer trembling, and pressed her palm flat against his bare chest, directly over his heart. Her other wrist, the one that had borne the queen's mark, she rested against it. And I am yours, she declared. The moment her skin touched his, the bond flared into brilliant life. The mark on her wrist blazed with silver and gold light. At the same time, an identical mark burned itself into existence on his chest, directly beneath her hand. A golden sun, radiant and powerful, encircling a silver wolf, its head thrown back in a triumphant howl. The bond was complete. A two-way street. A perfect union of souls. The last vestiges of pain vanished, replaced by a wave of such profound love, belonging, and rightness that it brought tears to her eyes. This was home. This feeling, this man, this connection, this was the home her soul had been searching for her entire life. They returned to the pack house at dawn. They didn't ride as a conquering army, but as a king and queen returning to their people. Kaelin kept her seated before him on his great war horse, his arms a constant protective circle around her. He convened the entire pack in the great hall, the same hall where she had scrubbed floors, the same hall where Lyra had humiliated her. The air was thick with confusion and nervous anticipation. Kaelin and Alara walked to the center of the room, hand in hand. His warriors brought Lyra forward, her face pale and pinched, her wrists bound. Kaelin's voice boomed, echoing off the high rafters. You have known this woman as an outcast, he began, his gaze sweeping over the crowd before settling on Alara with infinite softness. You have called her Death Hand. You were wrong. He gently took Alara's hand and raised it, showing them the glowing queen's mark on her wrist. A collective gasp went through the hall. This is Alara, he declared, his voice ringing with pride and power. My soulmate, my bondmate, and your queen. He then told them everything, of Morven and the Ember Covenant, of their dark magic and their long-laid plans, and he told them the truth of Luna Anja's death. The pup was stillborn because it had been blighted by shadow magic in the womb, a poison planted by Morven's agents years ago as a means to break me, Kaelin explained, his voice heavy with old sorrow. Luna Anja's death was a tragic consequence of that dark curse. No midwife, no healer could have saved them. Alara's hands are not hands of death. They were the hands that tried to save them from a fate that was sealed long before she ever entered the room. She bears no blame, only our gratitude for her courage. A wave of shame and regret washed over the faces in the crowd. They looked at Alara, truly seeing her for the first time, not as a pariah, but as a victim of the same enemy they all faced, and now as their savior. Kaelin turned to Lyra. His voice dropped, becoming deadly cold. You conspired with my enemy. You delivered your queen into his hands. For this treason, you are stripped of your name and your rank. You are exiled. You will leave before the sun sets and never return. Lyra crumpled, her arrogance finally shattering, but no one looked at her. All eyes were on Alara and their king. Kaelin gestured, and his regent, Lyra's own father, came forward. He carried a simple, elegant crown of woven silver and gold, fashioned to look like winter branches intertwined with sunbeams. His face was filled with a deep, solemn respect as he bowed his head to Alara. Kaelin took the crown. He turned to Alara, his golden eyes filled with a universe of love. From the shadows to the throne, he murmured, for her alone. From worthless to priceless, my queen. He gently placed the crown upon her head. It was cool and light. It fit perfectly. A cheer erupted in the hall, a thunderous, joyous roar of acceptance and celebration. Alara looked out at the sea of faces, at the people who had once scorned her, now cheering for her. She looked at the magnificent man beside her, her mate, her king, his hand holding hers as if he would never let go. The cold that had lived in her bones for so long was gone, banished forever by the radiant warmth of the sun in her soul and the love of her mate. She was not invisible. She was not worthless. She was Alara. She was a healer. She was a warrior. She was home. She was the queen. And she was loved.